So for this new update, we've assumed a growth rate of 1.5%. It's lower than the usage rate that we saw, but with that, it is, or excuse me, it's lower than the new account rates, but it's higher than the actual usage we saw. We split that simply because even if a second home comes in and is not using water, they still pay the base monthly charge. And so we split the difference really between those two rates and projected a 1.5% growth rate for the short term. And then the revenue requirements that were taken into account from the district's budget were O&M costs. That does not include any deferred maintenance fund. And I'll mention that because since Kevin's been in, he's been working close with the supervisors as far as that deferred maintenance fund that we've talked about on several occasions now about starting to accrue some money for that. So this does not include any type of a deferred maintenance fund. It does include our debt service bonding. It includes capital outlays, including capital improvement projects. We've factored in the recommendations from the master plan into these projections. And it does not include any rate revenue from taxes or expansion.
Mike, if I could.
And yeah, anybody who wants questions or interject, please.
Could you go back to that?
Yeah.
On his third line down there, or capital outlays, in working with staff, the document that I told you that I finalized this afternoon and we'll be talking about, the master plan that Bowen Collins did for us outlined $59 million worth of capital needs over the next
47 years.
40-some years. And what they did is they took that 59 million divided by 47 to come up with 1.26, something like that, $1 million per year, and that's the number that they plugged into their the model that they used to come up with their study here. When staff and I sat down and came up with the document, some years we're at $1 million, some years we're at $7 million, and Mike does not have that document in his hand. It'll be interesting to see what it looks like after you get a chance to look at it and say yes or no, or we need to move this here and there, what their model will look like at that point with the fluctuating numbers. Because I'll tell you, not every project's going to cost $1.26 million. Some of them are $5 million and some of them are $500,000. But what you'll see today is a good first start, and then there's going to be some changes as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, one of the things for the board members who are, well, as we looked at the master plan, one of the concerns, and I've mentioned already about that peak day production, is the cost of addition of a couple wells worth of capacity in these early years. That was a big concern at that time. And with the recent work that Aaron did with Lane Christensen and the wells around, there's been the additional production capacity that we gained from that exceeded what we expected. It turned out better than we had hoped. And as we look at several other alternatives to the previous kind of well development pattern that was happening, we feel like for significantly less we can meet those peak day production needs. But again, this does not reflect that. We've just, like Kevin said, we flatlined those projects through. There will be years where there's more of those, less of those, and so again, work in progress, and we'll be modifying this as Kevin pulls together his costs as well. So right now, we took the existing projected rate revenue based on water sales, and then increase that at an annual rate of 1.5%. That's what you're able to see there in this top row. Okay, through the next 5 years. The revenue requirement last year, in fiscal year 2012-2013, we had a deficit where there was no capital projects. But beginning with this fiscal year, we added in the capital projects, and you can see that continues on with a little bit of growth, as about the 1.5% growth as well. What that does is it ends up in a deficit of this year, or excuse me, using the numbers from last year, 10%, but once you start factoring in those capital improvement projects, it balloons quickly to 20%. So in assessing the best way to address that deficit and that shortfall that was seen, partly due to conservation, partly due to replacement and deferred O&M, and also capital improvements that will need to be done over the years, we looked at the current rate design. And by that I mean there's several different approaches to designing rates. Typically there's a monthly base charge that comes from the billing, measuring meters, kind of a base charge that's the administration of those accounts. And then there's a usage fee that's blocked into what we call a volumetric block rate that is intended to, well, it pays for the usage of the water, but typically there are some other uses of the block structure as well that I'll get into in just a minute. Before we move to that though, I want to, my asterisk here at the bottom is that this tier structure that we have here is more typical of a rural agricultural town, which is not surprising. I mean, that's the roots of the Virgin Valley Water System. But the current development trend and the demographics are not following a rural agricultural, but a suburban and in some cases even approaching urban approach. And I don't know, did we already hand out the rate structure?
There were some by the door for people that came in, and the board members do have this updated rate comparison.
So what I'll have you do is as you look at the different municipalities, the surrounding entities with the Virgin Valley Water District, you can see the different rate structures. Everybody addresses this a little bit differently as far as how they break up these blocks and what they charge for them. There is some science and theory behind that, and so I'll explain that and why we wanted to look at recommending a change to that. As you start to structure a rate or these volumetric blocks, typically you want that bottom or the lowest tier to be based on what your indoor usage requirements are. And the way we get to that is we take the 2 or 3 lowest usage months. In the case of Mesquite, that's typically December, January, and February. There's very little outdoor watering that's taking place, and so most of what you assume most of that usage is all to indoor, and that's a baseline usage. That's not going to change throughout the year. That's pretty typical. Then on the second tier, you take it should be based on conservation goals intended to reduce outdoor usage. And the way we calculate that, it's a little bit, the second and third tier are connected in that way, is that you set that third tier rate at your peak day demand, your average peak demand for your residential customers. And say, okay, on our peak day, or our peak months, what are we averaging using there? And with that, we want to encourage a certain degree of conservation of the resource, the water. And so we'll set the second tier at a percentage, some goal that we want to reduce usage by or encourage conservation. For example, some of the states in the Intermountain West have adopted a conservation target or a goal. And so in order to get 20% conservation, say by 2025, they'll set a goal in that second tier of a certain percentage below their peak day that would encourage people to spend less because it will allow them to stay in that second tier of usage. And for example, if you were to set your outdoor usage at 60% of your outdoor goal, what you'll end up doing is getting a net reduction of roughly 15 to 20% over the entire year. The reason being you're only reaching those peak usage rates during 2, 3, maybe 4 months out of the year that you're seeing that much of a reduction. You know, spread out over the entire year, that typically results in about half of the conservation that we'd like to see. And so that's typically how we kind of try to customize that second tier. The third tier we can set at the average peak day usage. The fourth tier is typically set to curb overuse, and really to kind of, especially in a place where the resource is so valuable, to avoid abuse of that resource. And not necessarily be punitive, but that the people who are using that much water is obviously exorbitant based on the development style that we see.